Chapter 1. The Night of Chains. The scent of blood and burning incense filled the grand hall of Noctis Dominion, where the crimson bonding ritual was underway. Vampires in flowing black robes stood in silent anticipation as the Alpha King, Dmitri Varen, ascended his obsidian throne. Tonight, he would choose a powerful, noble vampire who would strengthen his reign. But fate was cruel. The moment the ritual's ancient magic awakened, the room fell deathly still. Every eye turned toward Lucian Draven, the chained werewolf hybrid forced to his knees before the court. The glowing red sigil on his chest, proof of their bond, marked him as Dmitri's fated mate. A chilling silence settled before it shattered into chaos. The nobles gasped in outrage, some hissing in disbelief, others snarling for Lucian's immediate execution. Dmitri rose from his throne, golden eyes burning with fury. "This filth is my mate?" His voice dripped with disgust as he stalked forward, gripping Lucian's throat with crushing force. Lucian choked but met Dmitri's gaze with defiance, refusing to cower. "Kill me," Lucian rasped, lips curling into a bitter smile. "But you can't sever the bond." Dmitri's fangs bared in rage, but he hesitated, an instinct deeper than reason screaming at him to protect, not destroy. The weight of the bond clawed at them both, raw and suffocating. Dmitri released Lucian with a snarl, sending him collapsing to the stone floor. "Lock him away," he spat. "Let him rot in chains until I find a way to break this curse." The guards dragged Lucian out, his wrists bound in silver cuffs that burned his skin. Yet, as he was hauled through the corridors of the vampire palace, he couldn't ignore the way Dmitri's eyes lingered on him like a predator torn between devouring its prey and worshipping it. The pull of the bond was relentless, a cruel trick played by fate itself. As the heavy doors of a dark cell slammed shut behind him, Lucian exhaled shakily, his body trembling from the aftermath of the bond's revelation. He had spent his life as an outcast, abandoned by werewolves, despised by vampires never belonging to either. Now, he was trapped in the heart of enemy territory, claimed by the one creature who hated him the most. A twisted fate, indeed. But if Dmitri thought he would submit quietly, he was gravely mistaken. Lucian would fight. He would claw his way out of these chains, even if it meant bringing the blood tyrant to his knees. Chapter 2. A Dangerous Temptation. Lucian sat against the cold stone wall of his cell, wrists still bound in burning silver. Every time he moved, pain shot through his veins, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating pull of the bond. His body ached for Dmitri's presence, the primal need to be near his mate poisoning his mind. He hated it, hated the power the bond had over him. The sound of heavy boots echoed down the corridor, and his sharp blue eyes snapped toward the door just as it creaked open. Dmitri stood there, his expression unreadable, but his golden eyes betrayed the conflict raging within him. "You should be dead," Dmitri said coldly, stepping into the dimly lit cell. "A mongrel like you has no place in my court, let alone as my mate." His voice was filled with venom, but Lucian only smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Yet here I am," he taunted, even as his body trembled from exhaustion. Dmitri's jaw clenched, and in a blur of motion, he grabbed Lucian by the throat, yanking him to his feet. The touch sent a pulse of warmth through them both, their bodies reacting despite their hatred. Dmitri released him with a snarl, as if burned by the connection. Lucian's breaths were ragged as he leaned against the wall, watching Dmitri with hooded eyes. "The bond is cruel, isn't it?" he murmured. "Even you can't resist it." Dmitri's fists clenched at his sides, his entire body rigid. He hated that Lucian was right. His instincts screamed at him to claim his mate, but his pride and fury wouldn't allow it. "I will never accept you," he growled before turning on his heel and storming out, slamming the door shut behind him. But as he walked away, the heat of Lucian's skin still lingered on his fingers, and it infuriated him. Left alone once more, Lucian exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of their doomed connection settle over him like a curse. He could see it in Dmitri's eyes. No matter how much the Vampire King despised him, he would never be able to break the bond. And that gave Lucian just enough of an advantage. If he played his cards right, he could turn this situation around. If Dmitri wanted a battle, then Lucian would make sure he suffered just as much as he did. Chapter 3. Bound in Shadows. The next few days were torment. Dmitri avoided Lucian, but the bond gnawed at his mind like a persistent whisper, demanding he acknowledge his mate. He buried himself in royal duties, attending council meetings, overseeing war preparations, and drinking copious amounts of blood, yet nothing dulled the ache. The castle felt colder, as if rejecting its king's defiance. Worse, the nobles had begun whispering about his refusal to accept fate, his once unshakable image of dominance now wavering under the weight of an unclaimed mate. Lucian, on the other hand, refused to be forgotten. Though still imprisoned, he pushed against his restraints, testing every weakness in his chains. The guards treated him like a caged beast, but he was patient. He knew Dmitri would come back. He had to. The bond was cruel, and it would drive them both mad. The next time the doors opened, Lucian was ready. This time, Dmitri didn't come alone. A noble vampire, Lord Castian, entered with him, his silver hair glinting under the dim torchlight. "Surely, my king," Castian mused, eyes scanning Lucian with disdain, "you don't intend to keep this mutt alive?" Dmitri remained silent, his expression unreadable. Lucian knew that look indecision. He smirked. "Go on, Dmitri. Kill me," he challenged, holding Castian's gaze. "Or is the great Alpha King too weak to do what needs to be done?" Dmitri's golden eyes flared with fury, but instead of answering, he turned to Castian. "Leave us," he ordered, voice sharp as a blade. Castian hesitated before bowing and exiting the cell. As soon as the door shut, Dmitri grabbed Lucian by the chin, forcing their eyes to meet. "You will regret ever being bound to me," he hissed. But Lucian only grinned, his breath ghosting over Dmitri's lips. "Then make me." Chapter 4. The First Betrayal. Lucian let out a low chuckle, his silver-blue eyes gleaming with mischief despite the bruises on his skin. "You keep coming back," he taunted, his voice smooth but edged with something darker. "Should I start expecting love letters?" Dmitri's grip on his chin tightened, golden eyes flickering between fury and something dangerously close to longing. "You talk too much," Dmitri growled, shoving Lucian back against the wall. The impact should have hurt, but Lucian only smirked, tilting his head. "And you stare too much. If I didn't know better, I'd think you wanted to kiss me." Dmitri's expression twisted, but the bond betrayed him. The scent of Lucian's blood, the heat of his breath, it was intoxicating. He hated it. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Dmitri murmured, stepping closer until their bodies nearly touched. "But you're just a dog in a cage, playing at being dangerous." Lucian's smirk widened as he leaned in ever so slightly. "And yet, you're the one getting close, vampire," he whispered, voice tauntingly soft. Dmitri's breath hitched, just for a second, but Lucian caught it. He didn't miss the way Dmitri's fingers twitched, the way his fangs dragged over his lower lip as if suppressing an urge. For a moment, the tension between them crackled like a storm. Dmitri's hand moved, fingers brushing against Lucian's jaw in a ghost of a touch, so brief, so unintentional it could have been ignored. But Lucian didn't let him. "Ah," he hummed, feigning realization. "You do want me, don't you?" Dmitri reacted instantly, shoving him away with a snarl. "You mean nothing to me," he snapped, as if convincing himself. Lucian laughed, genuinely amused. Sure. That's why you keep coming back, touching me, staring at my lips." Dmitri cut him off with a low growl, turning away. But before he could storm out, Lucian's voice dropped to something softer, something real. "If I mean nothing, why can't you kill me?" Dmitri froze. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. He could hear Lucian's heartbeat, steady but waiting. Vulnerable, despite the teasing. Dmitri clenched his fists, his pride warring with the truth. Without another word, he turned on his heel and left, slamming the door behind him. As the sound echoed through the stone walls, Lucian let out a slow breath, his smirk fading. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. "Why do I feel like I just lost?" Chapter 5. The Hunger Between Us. Lucian lay on the cold floor of his cell, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of Dmitri's hesitation. That hesitation meant something. It was a crack in the unshakable Alpha King's armor, and Lucian intended to pry it wide open. The bond was a curse, but maybe, just maybe, it could be his greatest weapon. The sound of approaching footsteps made him grin before he even turned his head. "Missed me already?" he drawled as the cell door creaked open. Dmitri stepped inside, arms crossed, face unreadable. "You need to feed," he said flatly, tossing a blood bag onto the ground near Lucian's feet. Lucian arched a brow, unimpressed. "Oh, no fancy goblet? No presentation? What kind of king are you?" Dmitri's expression remained cold, but Lucian caught the twitch of his lips, just barely. "Drink," Dmitri ordered, but Lucian only smirked and leaned back. "Why don't you make me?" He let his head tilt slightly, exposing the column of his throat. "Or better yet, why not feed me yourself, my king?" Dmitri's jaw tightened. He was fast. 1 second, he was at the door, the next, he had Lucian pinned against the wall. His fangs extended, his golden eyes darkened with hunger. "Don't tempt me," Dmitri warned, voice lower, rougher. Lucian, despite the fire in his veins, only grinned. "I already am." For a moment, the air between them burned, intimate, dangerous. Dmitri's fangs hovered over Lucian's skin, his breath hot against his throat. Then, with a sharp exhale, Dmitri shoved away. "You're insufferable," he muttered, storming out of the cell. Lucian let out a breathless laugh, touching his throat. "And you, my dear Alpha King, are starving." Chapter 6. A Taste of Weakness. Dmitri sat on his throne, gripping the armrests so tightly they threatened to crack. His hunger had worsened since he last saw Lucian, his control slipping. He refused to admit the truth. The bond wasn't just pulling him toward his mate, it was breaking him. The longer he denied it, the weaker he became. His trusted advisor, Castian, noticed. "Your strength is faltering," Castian remarked, watching Dmitri with sharp eyes. "The bond is punishing you." Dmitri scoffed, forcing himself to sit straighter. "I am not bound by anything," he said, though the words felt hollow. Castian tilted his head. "Then why haven't you killed him? Or better yet, why do you keep visiting him?" Dmitri stiffened. He had no answer. Castian smirked knowingly. "Careful, my king. A wolf with sharp teeth can still bite, even in a cage." Dmitri ignored him, rising from his throne. He needed to see Lucian, not because he wanted to, but because the bond demanded it. That was all. When he arrived at the cell, Lucian looked worse, paler, weaker. His hunger was clearly taking a toll. Still, he smiled when he saw Dmitri, his voice hoarse but teasing. "Back again? Should I be flattered?" Dmitri sighed, rubbing his temple. "Just drink the damn blood." But Lucian shook his head, his smirk fading. "It won't work. I need something stronger." Dmitri inhaled sharply. He knew what Lucian was asking for. His blood. His own fangs ached at the thought, at the intimacy of such an act. Lucian met his gaze, tired but defiant. "What's the matter, Alpha?" "Afraid I'll enjoy it." Chapter 7. The First Bite. Dmitri cursed himself for being here, for even considering this. "You don't deserve my blood," he growled, but Lucian only smirked weakly. "No, but you'll give it to me anyway." The arrogance in his tone should have angered Dmitri, but it only fueled the fire already burning between them. Without another word, Dmitri stepped closer, his golden eyes locked onto Lucian's. Then, with deliberate slowness, he tilted his head, baring his wrist. "Drink. And don't make me regret this." Lucian didn't hesitate. The moment his lips touched Dmitri's skin, a jolt of energy surged between them. His fangs pierced flesh, and Dmitri sucked in a sharp breath. The bond roared to life, an intoxicating mix of pain and pleasure flooding his senses. He should have felt disgusted, but instead, he felt alive. Lucian groaned, his grip tightening around Dmitri's wrist as warmth spread through his starving body. The taste was addictive, rich, powerful, intoxicating. Dmitri's heartbeat quickened, his free hand gripping Lucian's shoulder as if grounding himself. When Lucian finally pulled away, his lips stained crimson, his breathing was uneven. Dmitri expected a snide remark, but instead, Lucian just stared at him, eyes dark with something unfamiliar. "That was a mistake," Dmitri muttered, stepping back. Lucian chuckled, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Then why did you let me?" Dmitri had no answer. He turned, leaving without another word, but even as he walked away, the ghost of Lucian's lips against his skin burned like a brand. Chapter 8. Unraveling Control. Dmitri didn't return for 3 days. In that time, Lucian's strength returned, but so did something else, an unbearable craving. He could still taste Dmitri's blood, still feel the echo of his pulse against his lips. It was maddening. And it wasn't just hunger. It was the bond, pulling, twisting, demanding. When the door finally creaked open, Lucian looked up with a lazy grin. "Miss me?" Dmitri didn't answer. Instead, he tossed a fresh set of clothes at him. "Get dressed. You're coming with me." Lucian arched a brow, unfolding the dark tunic and leather pants. "Oh, taking me on a date already? I prefer candlelight, but I'll take what I can get." Dmitri ignored him, arms crossed, jaw tight. "We're leaving the dungeons." That caught Lucian's attention. He stood slowly, stretching as he eyed Dmitri. "Let me guess. The nobles are restless? Your council wants me dead." Dmitri's lips pressed into a thin line. "They don't matter." The way he said it made Lucian pause. Something had changed. He could see it in Dmitri's posture, in the way his golden eyes flickered with something close to hesitation. Lucian took a step closer, his voice softer now. "And what do you want, Dmitri?" The Vampire King exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know," he admitted, and for the first time, it wasn't a lie. Lucian's smirk faded. He wasn't sure why, but hearing Dmitri's uncertainty felt like a victory, and a loss. Chapter 9. A Game of Power. The grand hall was filled with murmurs the moment Lucian stepped inside, his presence an insult to the high-ranking alphas seated around the chamber. Their gazes bore into him like daggers, but Lucian only smirked, straightening his shoulders as if he belonged. Dmitri, standing beside him, radiated authority, but the tension between them hadn't lessened since their last encounter. "Your Majesty," one elder spoke, his voice sharp with disapproval. "Why is the prisoner here?" Dmitri's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Because he is mine." The declaration sent a ripple of shock through the room. Lucian turned his head slightly, surprised. It wasn't an admission of love, nor was it gentle, but it was a claim undeniable and raw. He expected Dmitri to look away, to avoid his gaze, but the Alpha King met his eyes with quiet defiance. Lucian felt something shift in his chest. Was this power? Or something else? Another elder scoffed. "You cannot claim a traitor. It is a disgrace to your bloodline." Dmitri's golden eyes darkened. "And yet, here he stands." His voice was final, leaving no room for argument. Lucian let out a slow breath. This wasn't just about the bond. Dmitri was protecting him, in his own stubborn, ruthless way. The realization was as thrilling as it was dangerous. Lucian turned to the elders with a slow, mocking grin. "Well, gentlemen," he drawled, "it looks like you'll have to deal with me a little longer." The silence that followed was suffocating. The power struggle had begun, and Lucian intended to play his part well. Chapter 10. The Price of Defiance. "You're playing a dangerous game," Dmitri muttered as they walked through the palace corridors. Lucian stretched, rolling his shoulders. "And here I thought you liked danger," he teased. But the look Dmitri gave him was deadly serious. "They want you dead, Lucian." His voice was quiet but edged with frustration. "I can only protect you for so long." Lucian smirked. "Protect me? Or keep me for yourself?" He expected a sharp retort, maybe even another threat, but instead, Dmitri sighed. He looked tired. "Why do you do this?" Dmitri asked, voice quieter now. "Push me. Test me." Lucian hesitated, something vulnerable flickering in his expression. "Because it's the only way to know if you'll break," he admitted. Dmitri's hand shot out, grabbing Lucian's wrist, pulling him close. Their faces were inches apart, breaths mingling. And if I do? Dmitri murmured, voice laced with something dangerous. Lucian swallowed, heat creeping up his spine. Then I win, he whispered. Dmitri exhaled sharply before releasing him. You're impossible, he muttered, stalking ahead. Lucian watched him go, rubbing his wrist absent-mindedly. Dmitri didn't see the small smile that tugged at his lips, half amused, half something else. Maybe he was playing a dangerous game, but so was Dmitri. And for the first time, Lucian wasn't sure who would win. Chapter 11. Bound in Blood. Dmitri's nightmares had returned. Visions of war, of the bloodshed that made him king, plagued his sleep. But this time, there was something new. Lucian, standing in the wreckage, his silver-blue eyes burning with something unreadable. Dmitri woke with a start, breath ragged, hands trembling. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. This bond was ruining him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Enter," he said. His voice steady despite the chaos inside him. The door creaked open, revealing Lucian. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes searching. Dmitri sighed. "What do you want?" he asked, though his voice lacked the usual bite. Lucian hesitated before stepping closer. "You gave me your blood," he said quietly. "Now let me give you something in return." Dmitri's eyes narrowed. "What?" Lucian smirked, but there was something genuine behind it. A distraction. And before Dmitri could argue, Lucian closed the distance, his lips brushing against Dmitri's, teasing, testing. Dmitri froze, every nerve in his body on fire. The kiss was light, barely a touch, but it shattered something inside him. Lucian pulled back, watching him carefully. "See," he whispered. "Distraction." Dmitri exhaled shakily. "You're infuriating." Lucian grinned. "And yet, you're still here." Chapter 12. A Dangerous Temptation. Dmitri didn't acknowledge the kiss the next morning. He acted as if it never happened, throwing himself into his duties, ignoring the heat that lingered in his veins. But Lucian wasn't so easily ignored. "So, was it good for you?" he teased when they crossed paths in the training yard. Dmitri shot him a glare. "Drop it." Lucian sked. "Touchy." He circled Dmitri like a predator, his smirk growing. "You liked it," he accused. "And that terrifies you, doesn't it?" Dmitri clenched his fists. "You think this is a game?" His voice was dangerously low. "Our bond isn't something to toy with." Lucian's amusement faded slightly. "No," he admitted, tilting his head. "But that doesn't mean I can't enjoy watching you struggle with it." Dmitri exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're impossible." But Lucian saw the way his fingers twitched, the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed. He was getting under his skin. And that was the real game. Chapter 12. A Dangerous Temptation. Dmitri didn't acknowledge the kiss the next morning. He acted as if it never happened, throwing himself into his duties, ignoring the heat that lingered in his veins. But Lucian wasn't so easily ignored. "So, was it good for you?" he teased when they crossed paths in the training yard. Dmitri shot him a glare. "Drop it." Lucian sked. "Touchy." He circled Dmitri like a predator, his smirk growing. "You liked it," he accused. "And that terrifies you, doesn't it?" Dmitri clenched his fists. "You think this is a game?" His voice was dangerously low. "Our bond isn't something to toy with." Lucian's amusement faded slightly. "No," he admitted, tilting his head. "But that doesn't mean I can't enjoy watching you struggle with it." Dmitri exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're impossible." But Lucian saw the way his fingers twitched, the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed. He was getting under his skin. And that was the real game. Chapter 13. The Breaking Point. Lucian's eyes glinted as he leaned against the wall of Dmitri's study, watching the Alpha struggle with his thoughts. The tension in the room was thick, and for the first time, Lucian could see the cracks in Dmitri's armor. "You look like you want to break something," Lucian teased, his voice low. Dmitri's gaze flicked toward him, the muscles in his jaw working. Don't pretend you're not the reason I want to, Dmitri growled, his voice rough with frustration. Lucian's smirk only widened. And yet, you won't do it. Because deep down, you know you can't live without me. The words were like a challenge, a dare, and Dmitri's eyes flashed dangerously. Dmitri took a step forward, his presence overwhelming. You think you know me? You don't know anything, he bit out. Lucian raised an eyebrow, unfazed. Then tell me, Dmitri. Tell me how you really feel. Or would you rather keep pretending this bond doesn't mean anything? Dmitri's breath hitched, and for a moment, there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. He was close, too close, and Lucian could feel the heat between them. I hate you, Dmitri whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Lucian's heart skipped. Liar, he breathed. And then, without warning, he kissed him. Chapter 14. The Struggle Within. The kiss was raw, desperate, and for a moment, neither of them could breathe. Dmitri's hands gripped Lucian's shoulders, pulling him closer, while Lucian responded with equal fervor. The tension between them snapped, and all the frustration, anger, and confusion that had built up over the past few weeks erupted in that one heated moment. But as quickly as it began, Dmitri pulled away, eyes wild with something that resembled fear. What are we doing? He asked, his voice trembling. Lucian was breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. We're giving in, he whispered, his voice unsteady. Dmitri's hand ran through his hair, frustration clouding his features. This isn't the way, he muttered. Lucian stepped back, feeling the weight of his own words. Maybe it's the only way, he said softly, his gaze locked onto Dmitri's. Dmitri turned away, his shoulders rigid with tension. I won't fall for this. Lucian laughed bitterly. You already have. The words hung in the air between them, an unspoken truth neither of them could deny. Chapter 15. Unseen Enemies. The next few days were filled with silence. Dmitri avoided Lucian as much as possible, retreating into his duties and ignoring the tension that lingered in the air. But Lucian wasn't about to let this go. He found Dmitri in the palace gardens, staring out into the distance, lost in thought. Running away again? Lucian's voice was smooth, teasing, but underneath, there was an edge of something deeper. Dmitri didn't look at him. I don't have time for your games, Lucian, he said, his voice tight. Lucian smirked. No. I thought we were past that. Dmitri's eyes flicked toward him, and for a moment, Lucian could see the struggle within. Dmitri was torn, and Lucian could feel it. What's really going on, Dmitri? Lucian asked quietly. Is it me you're afraid of? Or what this bond means for you? Dmitri's jaw clenched, and he turned away, his voice cold. I don't have time for weakness. Lucian stepped closer, his tone softening. Maybe you don't, but I do. The words were a promise, and as Dmitri turned to leave, he didn't see the way Lucian's eyes followed him, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Chapter 16. The Return of the Past. The peace that had settled over the palace was short-lived. Word spread of an incoming threat, enemies from Dmitri's past, bent on reclaiming what they had lost. The tension in the air thickened, and Dmitri could no longer avoid the reality of his situation. Lucian was his mate, but more importantly, he was the key to everything. We need to prepare, Dmitri said, his voice commanding as he addressed his council. Lucian watched from the side, arms crossed, his gaze intense. He was no longer just an outsider in this world. He had become a part of it, whether Dmitri liked it or not. What do you want me to do? Lucian asked, his voice low, almost teasing. Dmitri didn't look at him as he spoke. Stay out of my way. But Lucian could see the way Dmitri's hands clenched, the tension in his posture. Lucian smirked. You're not getting rid of me that easily. Dmitri's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Lucian could see the dangerous power simmering beneath the surface. You might regret that, Dmitri warned. But Lucian only leaned forward, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. I doubt it. Chapter 17. Infiltration. Dmitri stood in the war room, his eyes scanning the map laid out before him. His enemies were drawing closer, and he could feel the weight of his responsibilities pressing on him. Lucian, as usual, had been unusually quiet, watching from a distance. Dmitri couldn't ignore the tension between them, but right now, there were more pressing matters. "You're going to need me," Lucian spoke up, breaking the silence. Dmitri shot him a sharp glance, but his words were laced with something more than just authority. There was a hint of desperation. "You'll be a liability," Dmitri said. Lucian raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at his lips. "If I'm a liability, then why do you always want me around?" Dmitri clenched his fists, the temptation to grab Lucian and throw him out of the room overwhelming. But then he realized, Lucian was right. He couldn't fight this battle alone, and the more he tried to push Lucian away, the closer they became. Lucian was dangerous, yes. But in this moment, Dmitri understood that he needed him, even if it was a fact he wasn't ready to accept. Chapter 18. Under the Moon. The night was cool, the full moon hanging high in the sky as Dmitri and Lucian walked through the woods just outside the palace. The silence was comfortable, but there was an edge to it. Neither of them could ignore the fact that they had crossed a line. "You should know," Lucian began, his voice soft, "I'm not just some pretty face you can use when it's convenient." Dmitri glanced at him, his lips pressing into a tight line. "I never thought that," he replied quietly, though he couldn't quite meet Lucian's gaze. Lucian smiled, a sly, knowing smile. "Then why do you keep pushing me away?" He was close now, his breath mingling with Dmitri's. Dmitri didn't have an answer. His emotions were all tangled up, and every time he thought he had a grip on them, Lucian did something that made him question everything. Their bond was undeniable. Even if Dmitri hated it, he knew he couldn't break free. And maybe, just maybe, that was what frightened him the most. Chapter 19. The Battle Within. Back at the palace, Dmitri was preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The battle was coming, and there was no turning back now. As he walked through the halls, he could feel Lucian's presence, always lurking just behind him, like a shadow that refused to leave. "I don't want to fight," Dmitri muttered, his voice low. Lucian stepped beside him, his expression unreadable. "You don't have a choice." He sounded almost amused, but Dmitri could hear the underlying seriousness in his words. The weight of their situation hung over them both. If they didn't act now, they would lose everything: control, power, and maybe even each other. "Then we fight," Dmitri said, a grim determination in his voice. "Together." Lucian nodded, the tension between them crackling with unspoken words. "Together," he echoed, but neither of them could deny that even together, the odds were stacked against them. Chapter 20. Heart of Darkness. The battle had begun, and the palace was in chaos. Dmitri and Lucian fought side by side, their movements fluid, a perfect synchronization born out of necessity. Despite the violence of the situation, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared purpose. Lucian, with his usual cocky smile, disarmed an opponent effortlessly, glancing over at Dmitri. "You're getting better at this," he teased, his voice light. Dmitri didn't respond, his focus entirely on the enemy in front of him. He wasn't here for the praise, he was here to win. But even as they fought, Dmitri couldn't help but notice the dangerous allure of Lucian's presence. There was something about him that kept Dmitri off balance, something that made him crave Lucian's proximity. After the fight ended, bloodied and exhausted, Dmitri and Lucian stood in the aftermath. "We made it through," Dmitri said, his voice quieter now. Lucian smiled, but there was something deeper in his eyes, something that said, "We're not done yet." Chapter 21. A Twist of Fate. Dmitri woke to the sound of urgent voices echoing through the corridors of the palace. The battle was far from over. His mind raced, but when he turned to look at the figure beside him, his heart skipped a beat. Lucian lay sprawled across the bed, his features peaceful, but the tension between them was far from gone. Lucian stirred, his eyes opening to meet Dmitri's gaze. "Trouble," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. Dmitri nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Lucian stretched lazily, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You're going to need me," he said, almost as if it were a given. Despite the weight of the situation, Dmitri couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration for Lucian's confidence. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just Lucian's skill that made him invaluable, it was the bond between them. The bond that Dmitri was beginning to fear, because it wasn't just a weapon. It was something that could destroy them both. Chapter 22. The Edge of Desperation. The palace was on lockdown. Dmitri and Lucian had just returned from an exhausting day of strategizing when the news hit. One of Dmitri's most trusted allies had betrayed him. It was a gut-wrenching blow, but Lucian's presence beside him was a strange comfort. "Who can we trust anymore?" Dmitri muttered under his breath, his hands clenched into fists. Lucian stepped closer, his voice low. "You can trust me." Dmitri's head snapped up, searching Lucian's face for any sign of insincerity, but found none. Lucian's gaze never wavered. "I'm not like them. And you know it." The words were a promise, a shield Dmitri didn't think he needed but couldn't deny. His alpha instincts screamed at him to remain guarded, but Lucian's quiet strength chipped away at the wall he had spent so long building. The room grew quiet as Dmitri finally let out a breath, the weight of his own choices bearing down on him. "Then we move forward. Together," Dmitri said, though it was more of a command than an agreement. Chapter 23. The Price of Loyalty. As the days dragged on, the tension between Dmitri and Lucian shifted from irritation to something more complex. Their bond was undeniable, and though Dmitri fought it with every fiber of his being, he couldn't ignore the growing attraction. But he couldn't afford weakness, not in front of the enemy, not in front of anyone. "Stop pretending," Lucian said one night, his voice steady, though there was an edge to it. "You think I don't see it?" Dmitri turned sharply, his gaze locking with Lucian's. "See what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Lucian's lips quirked into a smile, though it was tinged with bitterness. "The way you look at me. The way you want to hate me, but you can't. You're terrified of it, Dmitri." Dmitri's fists tightened, his body tense as his emotions warred within him. "You have no idea what you're talking about." But even as he said the words, Dmitri could feel the truth of them, a truth that terrified him. Chapter 24. Breaking the Chains. The conflict had reached its boiling point. Dmitri and Lucian were no longer just allies, they were entwined in a battle of wills, of hearts. The bond between them was something neither of them could ignore any longer, and the fight that had once seemed distant was now on their doorstep. "You can't keep pushing me away," Lucian said, his voice low and dangerous as he stood face to face with Dmitri. "I'm not going anywhere." Dmitri met his gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. "I never said you had to," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. It was a dangerous game they were playing, one that could destroy them both. But the pull between them was too strong to resist. Dmitri didn't want to admit it, but the truth was undeniable. He needed Lucian. And perhaps, just perhaps, Lucian needed him too. Chapter 25. Unbreakable Bonds. The final battle loomed large, but it wasn't just a fight for power, it was a fight for their future. Dmitri and Lucian stood together, side by side, ready to face the enemy that had plagued them for so long. But the real battle was within themselves. "Are you ready for this?" Lucian asked, his voice tinged with a rare vulnerability. Dmitri looked at him, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. "I've never been more ready," Dmitri said, his voice firm. The final confrontation was brutal, but through it all, Dmitri and Lucian fought as one. The bond between them had grown stronger than anything they had faced, and together, they emerged victorious. But the war was far from over. As the dust settled and the palace returned to a fragile peace, Dmitri looked at Lucian, his mate, his equal, his other half. "This isn't the end," Dmitri murmured, a new resolve in his heart. "No," Lucian replied with a smirk, "it's only the beginning."